Another key institution in medieval Europe was that of chivalry and knighthood. It's the one that people usually think of when they think of the Middle Ages. So I want to kind of address what chivalry and knighthood is and why it was important in medieval Europe. Uh, a knight basically is just a soldier on horseback in heavy armor. And that sounds pretty simple, but in the early Middle Ages, that was kind of a new idea. In ancient Rome, people who rode horses were in the military were usually used as scouts. They didn't wear heavy armor. This changed around the time of Charles Martel. You might remember he was the mayor of the Franks who drove out the Saracens, the North African Muslims, from France. And when he was there, he noticed that they were also using heavy armor on horseback. And he borrowed that idea and started to sort of institutionalize it, having his nobility, his upper class fighters, start to wear heavy armor. One of the things that really made this possible was the invention of the stirrup. That's the bit that hangs down from a saddle that you put your feet into when you ride a horse. The key there is that a knight with a stirrup can actually stand up in the saddle, and that allows a knight to swing heavy weapons and wear heavy armor. Knights came from the nobility because they're really the only ones who could afford heavy armor and training that you would need to fight in this particular style. And so fighting became institutionalized as sort of an upper class activity. It was the nobility who fought. And around that, you gradually get this culture that's known as chivalry. The word chivalry comes from the French word chevalier, which means a guy who rides horses. So essentially, the word chivalry means like knightness. And the idea of chivalry is basically that what makes knights successful is not only their, armor and training and money, but the fact that they're noble and that they abide by these certain rules. And in the Middle Ages, you had this sort of idea that there was this law of chivalry, things that knights were supposed to do. Now, there's not like one record of what chivalry is, but generally you have the idea that a knight's supposed to be loyal to sort of three groups of people. He's supposed to be loyal to his lord. This meant two things, both his earthly lord, his feudal lord, but it also meant God and the church. He's supposed to be loyal to countrymen, and sometimes that was interpreted as literally people from his country, although, the idea of a nation wasn't much of a thing yet. Or it could mean loyal to fellow Christians or to fellow knights. It sort of depended on who you asked and what was convenient. And loyal to his chosen lady. This idea we have today of chivalry sort of meaning, politeness of men towards women kind of is rooted in that as well. These ideas of chivalry really go back or popularized by legends and stories. One in England was the Legends of King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table, which really is descended from older pre-Christian myths in Britain. Another epic poem from the Middle Ages in France was the Song of Roland about one of Charlemagne's knights. One way those stories were spread was through troubadours. Troubadours were sort of traveling storytellers and musicians who would go from village to village, or if they were famous enough, from feudal manor court to court. And there they would sing songs and tell stories that sort of popularized these ideas. One thing to note is that this really kind of institutionalized some of the gender differences in medieval society. There was idea that women were to be, fought over, and they inspired knights, and when they went into battle, they would wear their chosen lady's scarf or pendant or what have you. But really, it meant that in chivalry, at least, women had very little, value outside of just sort of being fought over and being objects of affection. So it sort of helped institutionalize the position of women as not have a lot of power in the Middle Ages. One other way that the idea of knights and chivalry spread was through tournaments. One problem that medieval society started to have in around the middle of the Middle Ages was that you had all these people whose job it was literally just to fight, and not a whole lot of wars. As there's less conflict between some of the medieval states, you had a lot of knights who, were looking to show their strength and power and everything else. And so sometimes you'd have sort of constant fights and raids between knights without any real cause. So gradually had the system of tournaments develop. Essentially, it was a place for knights to show off their skills and to hone their practice, and sometimes for them to win money, usually from each other. Usually, when we think about medieval tournaments, we think of jousting like you might see at the Renaissance Festival. Really, jousting was more of a medieval sport I'm sorry, a Renaissance sport. That's why it's at the Renaissance Festival. In the Middle Ages, the melee or the mock battle was the most popular sport. Essentially, you'd have a huge field surrounded by stands or places for people to watch, and knights would come out usually with blunted weapons, but still in full armor, and they'd just battle each other, and till they could unhorse one another. So it was a way that peasants and regular people would sort of see these knights they heard about in stories, but also a way for knights to, show off their strength and skill, and for the lords to send their knights somewhere else. They wouldn't be fighting each other all the time. So it's sort of a win for everybody there.